ADHD and Anarchism, Personal Reflections on Neurodivergent Tendencies by the Cactus Collective. I've always known that something about me was different than other people. The way I talked, the way I acted, the way I thought about things, and especially the way I related to my environment. I'm not lazy, I'm not stupid, I'm not bad, I'm not rude, I just have ADHD. Don't get me wrong, I'm not labeling myself or ceding power to the exclusive club of psychological health care by using those letters to describe myself. This is simply to get us on the same page so we both know what I'm describing here. Doctors use the criteria of inattentiveness and hyperactivity to classify someone like me as having ADHD, but there's so much more to it than that. ADHD isn't a sickness or something that needs to be fixed. It's just a different way of living, a different way of experiencing and interacting with the world around us. If you're an anarchist, you probably see the comparison I'm trying to draw here. People with ADHD do not fit into the system of control that exists to turn us into good, law-abiding citizens. From the time we're kids, we're forced to adhere to hierarchical structures of power and coercion. We can't sit still, we can't follow instructions, we can't read quietly, we can't behave ourselves, so we must be punished or medicated in order to fit into that school system. This is what people with ADHD and anarchists have in common. We both clash with systems that oppress us in one way or another. I happen to have and be both. This isn't so much an appeal to others who are not neurotypical, NT, but an analysis of the structures we as anarchists critique through the lens of someone who is not neurotypical. The main point that I'll be making throughout this piece is that ADHD is not compatible with capitalism or the state. When you have ADHD, everything and nothing are interesting to you. One day you want to learn how to juggle. The next day you decide you want to learn about maritime distress signals used in the mid-20th century. If I had to reduce this to an analogy, it would be this. Having ADHD is like going to a buffet and putting everything on your plate, but only taking one bite of everything you grabbed. We're taught to decide as if we're not going to change our minds later on. This is why when I was a kid, I played baseball, soccer, football, did martial arts, even joined Boy Scouts. That's a whole other can of worms. I would pick up a hobby for a month, get bored, quit, then move on to the next one. As a result, I know how to play just about every team sport. I can also surf, skate, snowboard, juggle. I can play hacky sack, dance, sing, play multiple instruments, and even compose songs. I can draw, paint, make furniture, build basic structures, and cook a mean Cajun dish. I'm even slightly bilingual. However, I grew up with a hefty amount of privilege that allowed me the space, time, and money to bounce from hobby to hobby without ever worrying about going hungry or going homeless. The way I grew up is about as far from most people's reality as could possibly be. Most people can't write a check to sign up their kids for even one sport, let alone half a dozen sports. Most people can't afford a skateboard or a snowboard for their kids, let alone both. When you have children to feed, you do whatever you have to do in order to take care of your family, even if it means working 60-hour weeks. If your parents didn't make a lot of money, you went to school and maybe an after-school program. There's no time for money to do other things when you live in poverty. It severely limits a person's creative outlets and what they could achieve if they just had the space to explore. This is where ADHD starts to tie in. We understand that this world is not set up to nurture our creative expressions, our hobbies, or our ambitions. We don't want to perform a repetitive, mundane task for 40 hours a week, like anybody does, I guess. We crave things that are fast and mentally stimulating. We need to be challenged on occasion. Capitalism simply does not allow this to happen. Under capitalism, job insecurity means homelessness, starvation, disease, and even death. If I were able to quit my job, I'd spend a month teaching kids how to skateboard, and I would be the happiest person on the planet. Then once I got bored, I'd spend some time fishing or building houses, who knows? But I haven't ever done that, and I won't ever do that because I like a roof over my head and a couple scraps of food on the table. This system of control called capitalism keeps us from doing what we need to do to feel fulfilled in our lives. When we have ADHD, it's that much more obvious and in our face. And then there's the entire slew of symptoms that are also incompatible with capitalism. The attention span of people with ADHD is pretty much the only thing the general population knows about us. We have trouble remembering things because we have trouble paying attention in the first place. This makes job training so much more difficult for people like us because we hear instructions once and they disappear from our stream of consciousness as if they were never there to begin with. This is a huge problem for us because companies will simply refuse to change their methods of training to accommodate non-neurotypical people because it would hurt their bottom line. Our mere existence in a non-neurotypical capacity is enough to deny us work. You might be thinking that there must be some kind of social safety net in place to provide for us or protect us. After all, ADHD is a recognized developmental disorder. You would be mistaken, however. There are no services for us. There are no protections for us. We cannot apply for disability like our other non-neurotypical friends. We fall between the cracks every fucking time. We're more likely to be addicted to drugs or alcohol. We're more likely to end up homeless, less likely to get a bachelor's degree, and almost none of us end up with a graduate degree. We find ourselves in the emergency room more than any other group of people, too. We almost always have comorbid disorders, the most common being depression, anxiety, dyslexia, and panic disorder. I get severely depressed knowing what can happen to me if I slip up even once. For most of us, looking into the future is fucking terrifying because we have this extra hurdle in our way, except for one minute detail. The hurdle isn't real. It's entirely fabricated by capitalism. We can learn just fine. We can concentrate and get things done just like everyone else. We just need to do it in our own way. Our way is usually longer and more expensive, though, which is why so many of us have been fired from at least a few different jobs. We hurt the bottom line of the capitalist. Therefore, we do not fit into the capitalist scheme. Another key point of difference is creativity. We are some of the most creative people on the planet. Almost half of the musicians you listen to have ADHD, for fuck's sake. This might be an argument for why it actually is compatible with capitalism because, look, they all have money. The reality, though, is not that creativity is rewarded by capitalism, but that creativity is usually punished by capitalism. This is why the majority of artists, writers, and musicians live in poverty. If capitalism rewards creativity, why do the vast majority of artists starve? Personally, I find it hard to believe that only a handful out of the 300 million people in the US are actually creative. That is, if we are using wealth as a measure of creativity. Have these millions of creative people just not been discovered yet? Fuck no. They'll never be discovered because they're busy blowing their brains out, washing your car, and serving you a hamburger. They're doing their best not to starve in a system that's designed to eat them alive for not being profitable. How creative could you be after 9 hours of pretending White Brenda's storefront meltdown over a coupon didn't bother you? I've been there. It made me feel sad and worthless, and above all, burnt out. The only thing I had room for after a shift at the local department store was a beer and a fistful of pills to help me sleep. It destroyed me on the inside because people with ADHD are creative people by nature. It's just how we are. I had to sacrifice that creativity to pay my bills because my creative outlets aren't profitable. I touched on public school a little bit, but didn't quite elaborate. School is a behemoth of a monster to tackle in an anti-capitalist analysis, even without adding ADHD into the mix. It's not really a secret that school doesn't function to educate. Education is coincidental to learning how to be an obedient worker. For the purposes of this piece, I won't go into detail about how public education functions to serve capital, but rather how ADHD is in direct opposition to the structure and function of public education. At school, the first thing you learn is that there are rules and that breaking these rules may lead to consequences, even when the rules are bullshit. Given that we already don't learn the same way as NTs, we would assume that there are systems in place at schools that approach us differently. If you haven't guessed, a common theme here is that we usually don't get help. Of course, the schools don't approach us differently. We're treated as if the same exact methods of teaching are a one-size-fits-all, and it's infuriating. We get excited and have trouble controlling our impulses, so we run from the playground to the classrooms after recess. Except running is only allowed on the playground, so we get detention for breaking the rules. This doesn't teach us anything, so we do it again tomorrow, and the next day, and the next day, and before too long we get increasing stiff punishments for normal goddamn child behavior. Some of us are suspended, some expelled, and in that moment we learn that we're different from everyone else. Some are lucky enough to get a diagnosis and a 504 plan. Some of us aren't so lucky. This is a critical point in our lives that has a massive amount of bearing on how we perceive ourselves in relation to our NT peers. I should also note that this moment has a shocking parallel to the state apparatus. White children are more likely to be given a diagnosis of ADHD than black children, and boys are given the diagnosis 4 times more often than girls. Not to mention that general prejudice favors white skin over black and brown skin, regardless of whether or not a student is neurotypical. This leads to some horrendous, unequal opportunities in the education system. If that doesn't sound familiar, then you probably aren't aware that black and brown folks are more likely to live in poverty, more at risk for heart disease, far more likely to experience police violence, and far more likely to be imprisoned. The parallel here between the state and the public education system could not be more clear. It also begs the question, if this is so unnatural for children to go through, how the hell is it natural for ADHD kids to go through? There's another thing about us that kind of sits inherently in the back of our heads. We are incredibly perceptive, and when we were kids, we shocked a lot of adults with how well we understood them and the fairness of their rules. I have been kicked out of countless classrooms, not just for being disruptive or combative, but for simply questioning the authority of the teacher and the dogma of the curriculum. It became very clear to me very early on that school is not about learning. It's about shutting up and accepting whatever dog shit is served to you by your master. Every person I've talked to with ADHD doesn't really have the ability to shut up and accept anything at face value. We're not content with the answer to a question. We want to know why the question is asked in the first place. If something isn't fair, we want to make it fair. If something isn't right, we want to make it right. This puts us in direct conflict with the education system. And this has been ADHD and Anarchism by the Cactus Collective. You can find them at No Nazi Riverside. Thank you so much.